Infrastructure plays a central role in shaping how cities experience and respond to climate change. As heatwaves, floods, droughts, and extreme weather events intensify, urban infrastructure systems increasingly function as the front line of climate adaptation. However, infrastructure is not neutral, it distributes protection, risk, and opportunity unevenly across urban populations. This topic explores how infrastructure can either reinforce existing inequalities or serve as a tool for more just and resilient urban development. By integrating equity into climate adaptation planning, cities can move beyond purely technical responses and toward strategies that reduce vulnerability, strengthen social resilience, and support long-term ecological and social stability. Infrastructure, equity, and climate adaptation are increasingly recognized as deeply interconnected dimensions of contemporary urban development. As climate change intensifies the frequency and severity of heatwaves, flooding, droughts, and extreme weather events, urban infrastructure systems play a critical role in shaping how cities absorb, respond to, and recover from these impacts. However, infrastructure is not simply a technical system for managing environmental risks, it is also a social system that distributes protection, exposure, and opportunity unevenly across urban populations. Historical patterns of planning, investment, and exclusion have produced landscapes where some communities benefit from robust protection and access to resources, while others remain disproportionately vulnerable to climate hazards. This topic approaches climate adaptation through an equity-centered lens, emphasizing that resilient cities cannot be achieved without addressing underlying social and spatial inequalities. Climate adaptation infrastructure, whether grey, green, or hybrid, must therefore be understood not only in terms of physical performance, but also in terms of who benefits, who bears risk, and who participates in decision-making. By examining the relationships between infrastructure systems, social vulnerability, and environmental justice, this topic highlights how adaptation strategies can either reinforce existing inequities or contribute to more just and inclusive urban futures. Integrating equity into climate adaptation planning enables cities to move beyond short-term risk reduction toward long-term socio-ecological resilience that supports both environmental stability and social well-being. Climate change places growing pressure on urban infrastructure systems, including drainage networks, energy grids, transportation systems, and public space. Increased rainfall intensity challenges stormwater systems, while prolonged heat waves strain energy and cooling infrastructures. Aging systems often lack the capacity to respond to these emerging climate conditions, resulting in service disruptions and increased exposure to hazards. Urban form interacts with infrastructure performance. Dense, impervious areas amplify heat and runoff, while fragmented green systems limit cooling and infiltration. Climate-adaptive infrastructure therefore requires systemic, long-term planning that recognizes infrastructure as an evolving socio-technical system rather than a fixed set of assets. Climate adaptation infrastructure refers to systems designed to reduce exposure to climate-related risks and to enhance urban capacity to cope with changing environmental conditions. These systems include flood protection, heat mitigation, water storage, shading, cooling, and drought management. Adaptation infrastructure may be protective, such as levees or cooling centers, or regenerative, such as wetlands, urban forests, and sponge city landscapes. Unlike mitigation, which focuses on reducing emissions, adaptation addresses the impacts that are already occurring and those that are unavoidable. Effective adaptation infrastructure must therefore balance immediate protection with long-term ecological and social resilience. Climate risks are not distributed evenly across cities. Low-income neighborhoods, informal settlements, and historically marginalized communities often face higher exposure to flooding, heat stress, and environmental hazards. These areas frequently lack access to high-quality green space, reliable cooling, or flood protection. Infrastructure gaps can compound social vulnerability, making it more difficult for residents to cope with extreme events. As a result, infrastructure planning becomes a key mechanism through which vulnerability is either reinforced or reduced. Understanding social vulnerability is therefore essential for designing adaptation strategies that protect those most at risk. Equity in climate adaptation refers to the fair distribution of both risks and benefits associated with adaptation investments. This includes prioritizing vulnerable populations, ensuring meaningful participation in decision-making, and recognizing historical patterns of exclusion and underinvestment. Equity is not the same as equality. Treating all neighborhoods the same can perpetuate existing disparities. Instead, equity-oriented adaptation directs resources to where they are most needed. Procedural justice, who participates in planning, and distributive justice, who benefits from investments, are both essential components of equitable climate adaptation. Environmental justice frameworks highlight how climate impacts often disproportionately affect marginalized communities due to historical planning practices, such as redlining, industrial zoning, and uneven infrastructure investment. These legacies shape present-day exposure to heat, flooding, and pollution. Health impacts associated with climate stresses, such as heat-related illness or water contamination, also follow these spatial patterns. Climate justice reframes adaptation as a moral and political issue, emphasizing that resilience cannot be achieved without addressing structural inequalities embedded in urban systems. Grey infrastructure includes engineered systems such as flood walls, levees, drainage pipes, pumping stations, cooling centers, and power grids. These systems provide large-scale, reliable protection and are often essential in high-risk environments. However, grey infrastructure can be rigid, expensive, and unevenly distributed. It may also shift risk rather than reduce it, protecting some areas while increasing vulnerability elsewhere. From an equity perspective, grey infrastructure investments can reinforce unequal protection if they prioritize economically valuable areas over socially vulnerable communities. Green and blue infrastructure refers to natural and semi-natural systems that provide climate adaptation benefits. Urban forests, wetlands, floodplains, green corridors, parks, and open water bodies reduce heat, store and filter stormwater, and enhance biodiversity. These systems deliver multiple co-benefits, including improved air quality, recreational opportunities, and mental health benefits. Green and blue infrastructure can also be more flexible and adaptive than grey systems. When equitably distributed, they play a critical role in reducing heat stress and flood risk in vulnerable neighborhoods. Hybrid infrastructure systems combine grey and green approaches to maximize resilience and flexibility. Examples include levees integrated with ecological buffers, streets designed as flood corridors, and public spaces that function as stormwater storage during extreme events. Hybrid systems provide redundancy, ensuring that if one system fails, others can compensate. This layered approach enhances resilience and allows cities to adapt to uncertain climate futures. Hybrid infrastructures also create opportunities to integrate social and ecological functions into traditionally technical systems. Nature-based solutions, NBS, are increasingly promoted as cost-effective and multifunctional adaptation strategies. However, their benefits are not automatically equitable. In some contexts, new green investments contribute to green gentrification, displacing vulnerable residents and shifting benefits to higher income groups. Equity-focused NBS planning requires deliberate strategies to ensure long-term affordability, community access, and local stewardship. When implemented with justice in mind, NBS can improve living conditions, reduce exposure to hazards, and strengthen social cohesion. Community-based adaptation recognizes that local residents possess valuable knowledge about risks, needs, and priorities. Participatory planning processes enable communities to co-design adaptation projects, increasing legitimacy, relevance, and long-term success. Community stewardship can also support maintenance and monitoring of green infrastructure and public spaces. Beyond physical outcomes, community-based adaptation strengthens social networks, trust, and collective capacity to respond to future shocks. Social resilience is therefore a critical dimension of climate adaptation infrastructure. Effective climate adaptation requires supportive governance and policy frameworks. These include climate adaptation plans, equity-focused funding mechanisms, and cross-sector coordination between infrastructure agencies, public health departments, housing authorities, and environmental organizations. Policy frameworks must mainstream equity into infrastructure decision-making rather than treating it as an add-on. Monitoring and accountability mechanisms are also essential to ensure that adaptation investments deliver promised social and environmental benefits. Infrastructure investment decisions shape long-term patterns of vulnerability and protection. Equity-oriented investment prioritizes high-risk communities and directs resources toward reducing exposure and enhancing adaptive capacity. Transparent prioritization criteria help ensure that decisions are based on need rather than political or economic influence. Public and private financing structures must also be evaluated to avoid maladaptation, where short-term fixes create long-term vulnerabilities. Equitable investment is a cornerstone of just climate adaptation. Urban heat islands disproportionately affect low-income and densely built neighborhoods with limited tree canopy and green space. Heat adaptation strategies include cooling corridors, shade networks, tree planting in vulnerable areas, and improved access to cooling centers. Heat health action plans integrate public health systems with infrastructure planning to protect vulnerable populations, such as the elderly and outdoor workers. These strategies demonstrate how targeted interventions can reduce health risks while improving urban livability. Flood-prone neighborhoods often face repeated damage and displacement. Flood adaptation strategies include green flood storage areas, restored floodplains, managed retreat, and resilient housing design. Equity challenges arise when relocation or property buyouts disproportionately affect marginalized communities. Fair flood adaptation requires transparent processes, adequate compensation, and long-term support for affected residents. These cases highlight the social dimensions of infrastructure-based adaptation. Measuring equity in climate adaptation requires indicators that go beyond physical performance. These include the spatial distribution of benefits, access to cooling and green infrastructure, health outcomes, and levels of participation in decision-making. Long-term social outcomes, such as reduced vulnerability and improved well-being, are critical metrics. Without equity-focused indicators, adaptation success may be overstated while underlying inequalities persist. Climate adaptation infrastructure must be understood as both a technical and social system. Integrating justice into design and planning requires multidisciplinary collaboration and long-term stewardship models. Practitioners must consider how infrastructure shapes everyday experiences and distributes risk. Designing for vulnerable communities and embedding equity into infrastructure planning strengthens both social and ecological resilience. Regenerative approaches recognize that resilient cities are built through inclusive, systemic, and adaptive strategies. Climate adaptation is fundamentally an equity issue. Infrastructure systems shape who is protected and who remains vulnerable. Green and hybrid systems offer opportunities to deliver multiple co-benefits, but only when implemented through justice-centered planning. The integration of equity into infrastructure planning improves not only environmental performance but also social resilience. Adaptation strategies that prioritize those most at risk are essential for building truly resilient cities. Key reflective questions include: who benefits from climate adaptation investments? How are vulnerable groups included in decision-making? How can infrastructure reduce rather than reinforce inequality? What does equitable resilience look like in practice? These questions encourage critical thinking about the social dimensions of climate adaptation and highlight the responsibility of planners, designers, and policymakers to align infrastructure with principles of justice and inclusion.